So thank you everyone for coming. I'm Angelica Diggs, so I'm the executive director of the Montclair History Center. So we host a once a month program series virtually on Zoom called History at Home. It's a sort of a COVID-born initiative that we've maintained and has really blossomed into some amazing ways to connect with other organizations like we are tonight and be able to do presentations such as this with others from across the country. So thank you for being here. I said this a few times, but if you're more than one person, or if you can tell us where you're from, please put that in the chat. Both us and the Loudoun Museum love that for our data. So thank you for sharing that with us tonight. Feel free to use the chat throughout the entire presentations. We'll do a live Q&A at the end. You can use the chat or you can unmute at the end. We can have some nice questions and discussion. So please feel free to do that tonight. And myself and Carrie, who's the director of the Loudoun Museum, will keep an eye on the chat as well, just to answer anything that we can as the presentation's going on. Tonight, we're just so thrilled to be joined by the Loudoun Museum of Leesburg, Virginia, with research volunteer Caroline O'Connell. So Caroline actually came to us many months ago as she was uncovering this research around flossy fur, which turned into an amazing research article. And then we said we need to do a program about this. So that's what sort of led us to tonight. So we're thrilled for her to be joining us as well. We're going to explore the experience of Flossie Fur, who is an African-American school teacher who was part of the Great Migration during the first decades of the 20th century and came here to Montclair. So that's how our organization's connected and how we're going to talk about that history having to do with both of our locations during the Great Migration tonight. Our presenter, Caroline O'Connell, is a volunteer with the Loudoun Museum. Her research interests include Loudoun's County historic African American communities and Black-owned businesses. So she has a master's degree in Russian area studies and from Georgetown University. So we're thrilled for her to share her research tonight and so we can learn more about Flossie's story. Before we get started with Caroline, I also just want to turn over to Carrie from Loudoun Museum to say a few words as well.
Hey. Great. Thank you all for being here. We're very excited to be able to partner with Montclair and have this evening together. The Loudoun Museum is a community museum dedicated to the history of Loudoun County in all its diversity, and we endeavor to try and tell whole histories, full stories as much as we can. And a lot of times that means we start with a small piece and then it grows and grows. And so we appreciate the opportunity to share what we know so far with you all. And beautifully, this has brought us the opportunity to connect with the fur family and many of Flossie Fur's children and grandchildren, several of whom are here with us tonight. So thank you, Elaine and Carolyn and Orton and Joan. And if I've missed anybody, my apologies. It's a little hard to see everybody on the screen, but we're really delighted to welcome family members here as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Caroline.
Yay. Thank you, Angelica. Thank you, Carrie. I really want to thank Angelica for giving me this opportunity to be here this evening. And many thanks to Carrie, who has supported my research and encouraged me to write for the blog. It's always exciting to write something that people actually read. And I'm really thrilled to have members of the Fur family here this evening. It is such a privilege to share the story of Flossie Fur. So I think one of the great things about tonight is that we have Montclair History Center together here with Loudoun Museum to share their knowledge of this interesting slice of the Great Migration. It's well known in Montclair that many African Americans there trace their roots to Loudoun and Fauquier counties, but this story is less well known here in Loudoun. So just for anyone who doesn't know the story, the Great Migration saw the exodus of some 6 million African Americans from the Jim Crow South to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. It was one of the largest movements of people in the US, and it's typically dated from 1915 to 1970. But the migration to Montclair started and ended earlier than that. The migration pattern from Loudoun and Fauquier counties to Montclair is just one of many examples of members from one community in the South moving to the same destination. And the first migrants would help those who followed find jobs and find housing. Um, I estimate that at least several hundred left Loudoun County for Montclair, but that's a little bit of a guesstimate. I like this photo because I like to think that many of the photos would have left Loudoun County from this train station here in Leesburg. I always appreciate it when speakers tell me what they're going to talk about, so I thought I'd share my line of march with you. We have a mixed audience tonight. Well, we have people from all over the place. So I thought I would start with a little overview of Loudoun County. And then I'll take a brief look at some of the demographics of Loudoun's outmigration just to understand the scale of the exodus. I'll examine some of the reasons why African Americans left Loudoun County and, importantly, why they came to Montclair. Flossie Fur gets only one bullet point here, but her story will form the bulk of my presentation. Her family migrated in the early 1900s to Montclair, and they are among the minority who returned to Loudoun. They chose to return to Loudoun. And then I'll conclude with a few thoughts about the lasting impact that this outmigration had on.
What are we eating?
On
right here.
So this is a map of Loudoun County. Kind of a big point to make is it's a pretty big county. It's 4 times the size of Essex County, where Montclair is located. And relatively sparsely populated, certainly very sparsely populated back in 1920. When it had about 1/30th the population of Essex County, and even now it has less than 1/2 the population of Essex County. Leesburg is the county seat and the largest town in the county. It's located about 35 miles west of Washington, D.C. And down in the corner here is Washington Dulles Airport. Purcellville is the second largest town in the county. It's in the western part of the county, and Flossie Fur spent most of her life in Purcellville. This cute little village of Middleburg down in the south is really right on the border with Fauquier County. It's a charming village, somewhat posh. A lot of money kind of moved into Middleburg in the early 20th century. One of the defining characteristics in Loudoun County today is there's an east-west divide in the county, and that divide follows this Route 15, goes right through the middle of Leesburg. East of Route 15, the county is highly suburbanized, and it's suburbanized pretty rapidly just in the last 20 or 30 years. West of Route 15, the county is still largely rural and agricultural. So this is a classic view of western Loudoun County looking west toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. I may be biased, but I think it's beautiful. And I like this photo because it captures this rural quality of western Loudoun. Up until the 1950s and early 1960s, Loudoun was a top dairy producer in Virginia, and now there's only one dairy farm left. But there are a few small beef cattle farms in Loudoun, and these tend to be small producers, pretty high end. And I just thought this cow was a very pretty example. I do want to point out the stone wall. These stone walls are a defining feature of western Loudoun County, and they go south into Fauquier County as well. They originally would have been built by enslaved workers, but they're still well maintained today. And one of the features of these stone walls is their dry stack, which means that there's no mortar or a cement holding them together. The stones had to be carefully fitted to create a solid wall. Loudoun and Fauquier counties are the heart of Virginia horse country. Fox hunting became popular in this area in the 1910s and early 1920s, and that's what attracted a lot of wealthy northern businessmen to this area. Even today, Loudoun still has more horses and more horse farms than any other county in Virginia. And yes, fox hunting is still a thing here. Again, I want to point out the stone wall in the background that runs along the road, and it is a gravel road. Loudoun has more gravel roads than any other county in Virginia, and apparently we like them, and we're trying to preserve them. Willisville is one of the oldest African-American communities in Loudoun, and it forms an interesting connection in the two families I'll talk about tonight. The Huey family were among the first Black landowners in Willisville, and they were also one of the first families to leave Loudoun for Montclair. Willisville also played a role in Flossie Furr's life. So Willisville predates the Civil War. It was a somewhat unique community because a mix of freed and enslaved individuals lived there. This is a view of the second school building, which was built in 1920. It's now a private home. In 1931, the school had one classroom, one teacher, and 76 enrolled students. The parents petitioned the Loudoun School Board to add another classroom and another teacher, and the school board actually obliged. And in 1934, Flossie Furr arrived here and taught for 1 year in the Willisville School. So I want to touch on the demographics of the out-migration from Loudoun. There's a lot of numbers here. I really want to focus on the two columns showing the change in the Black population. The key point is that Loudoun lost a far greater share of its Black population than Virginia did as a whole. Between 1900 and 1960, Virginia's Black population increased by about 25%. Loudoun's Black population decreased by about that same amount. And you'll see that Loudoun's Black population declined in every decade between 1900 and 1950. It saw a net decline. Whereas in Virginia, the only decade that saw a net decline in the Black population was the 1920s. Now, in reality, these numbers understate the number of people who are leaving because there would have been natural population growth. The steepest decline for Loudoun was the decade between 1900 and 1910. This is when Virginia introduced its post-Reconstruction Constitution in 1902. And then for Virginia, the decade that saw the largest out-migration of Blacks was from 1920 to 1930. And this is when the state passed some of its harshest Jim Crow laws. Out-migration from Loudoun was probably higher than for Virginia as a whole because of its proximity to Washington, D.C., and the presence of the Washington and Old Dominion Railroad, which ran all the way from the western edge of the county to Arlington, Virginia, which is just across the river from Washington, D.C. So, why were African Americans leaving? The biggest reasons were the lack of jobs and the low wages here in Loudoun County. But the poor schools also factored into it. Then, in addition to those sort of big three factors, the legal system in Virginia and elsewhere in the South turned its back on African Americans. It deprived them of their basic rights of citizenship and introduced a legally enforced system of racial separation. Virginia's 1902 Constitution institutionalized the disenfranchisement of African Americans through poll taxes and literacy tests. And these weren't just literacy tests, they were so-called knowledge tests, but any random question could be asked, like, how many people signed the Declaration of Independence? And if they didn't know the answer, that was disqualifying. The Constitution also required that all public schools in Virginia be racially segregated. The 1920s were a bad decade for racial relations in the United States as a whole, and Virginia was no exception. There was a resurgence of the KKK in the state, including here in Loudoun. White supremacy became entrenched in Virginia and throughout the South as a political ideology and as a tool of social control. The 1924 Racial Integrity Act, passed here in Virginia, introduced the most stringent prohibition against interracial marriage in the country. It made interracial marriage a felony, and it adhered to the so-called one-drop rule, which defined a white person as someone who had no trace whatsoever of the blood of a person of any other race. This act also required all citizens of Virginia to register their race with the state, and only two races were recognized, white or colored. So Native Americans were erased. 2 years later, the state passed the Public Assemblages Act, which was the first in the country to require the segregation of public entertainment spaces. Public transportation had already started being segregated in 1900. So if that's why they left Virginia, why did they come to Montclair? Montclair was and is a densely populated, wealthy suburb of New York City. It's less than 20 miles from New York City. It's located at the junction of two railroad lines, so it provided an easy commute for businessmen who worked in the city. It was densely populated, so it offered plenty of domestic service jobs for African Americans. And as early as the 1870s, wealthy whites in Montclair began recruiting African Americans to come work as household servants. African American servants in Montclair could command higher wages, higher earnings than they could here in Loudoun County. And one story goes of a young woman who increased her earnings as a house servant from $8 a week to $13 a week within 4 years of arriving in Montclair, simply by changing employers 3 times. So that's a 60% increase in her earnings. And that there just weren't that many jobs available in Loudoun. There were more people than jobs in Loudoun. Montclair also had an excellent public school system. It opened a new public high school in 1893 that was considered the best high school in the state. It was integrated, but African Americans could not attend school dances, and they were not allowed to participate in some extracurricular activities. The Black population grew really fast, really quickly in Montclair, and it became large enough. I think there was something like 126 African Americans in Montclair in 1880. And so by 1930, it had 6,380, and I can't even do the math to tell you what kind of an increase that is. But the point is that the Black population had enough disposable income and was large enough that it could support a small Black business district. And that combination of stable wages and excellent schools created a pathway for African Americans to obtain a college education and to enter professional careers as doctors, teachers, lawyers, and business executives. That pathway was not possible in Loudoun, which did not have a fully accredited four-year high school for African Americans until 1941. Say a bit more about the Huey family, who arrived in Montclair from Willisville in 1874. They were one of the first families to have left Loudoun for Montclair, and they were an early example of a Black migrant family who moved into the middle class in Montclair. They were entrepreneurial and they were successful. And Betty Holloway of the Montclair African American Heritage Association has done some great research on the family that I am drawing from here. So the father, who arrived in Montclair, he started out as a gardener and then later had his own business as a carpet layer, and he had 10 children. The oldest son, Clifford, started a newsstand in Montclair, and he is the first known African American to have owned and operated his own business. Two other sons founded a bicycle storage and repair business located right near the train station. So commuters could ride their bikes to the train station, leave them with the Huey brothers for safekeeping and whatever minor repairs were needed, and off they would go to work. Charles's daughter Alice was the first of the children who was born in New Jersey. She was the first African American to graduate from Montclair High School in 1894. More significantly, she founded Montclair's so-called colored YWCA. And the YWCA became a social and educational hub for Black women in Montclair for decades. And the staff and the programs there encouraged young Black women to pursue higher education and to develop leadership skills. The YWCA building was moved from its location on Glenridge Avenue to its current location, and it's now part of the Montclair History Center. Members of the Huey family owned this building from about 1906 to 1940. It housed several African American owned businesses. So the Hueys were not just property owners, but they were landlords. And the Huey family represents the kind of upward social mobility that was not possible for African Americans in Loudoun. Finally, we come to Flossie Furr's story. Why did she matter? During her lifetime, she navigated two seismic events of the 20th century, the Great Migration and that legalized system of racial separation in the South. As I said, she was among the minority of migrants who returned to Loudoun, but I believe that her time in New Jersey and Montclair as a young child deeply influenced her life. Flossie was the only child of Henry and Lorinda Sinclair. Her parents lived in Montclair at two separate times. In fact, they married in Newark, nearby Newark, in 1904. In Montclair, Flossie's father worked at various times as a chauffeur, butler, gardener, and handyman. Her mother worked as a cook, a maid, and a laundress. Flossie Furr later recalled that many African Americans from Loudoun would move to Montclair for a few years, save their earnings, and then come back to Loudoun and buy a home or a small farm. Her parents did this twice. So a few months after getting married, so in 1904, while they were still living in Montclair, her parents bought their first property in Loudoun, a 3-acre farm in the small community of Silkett Springs. I forgot to show you where Silkett Springs is on the map. It's a little bit south of Purcellville. So they bought a 3-acre farm there, and they moved here a few years later, right after Flossie was born. Her parents went back, or the family went back to Montclair in 1913. And while there, again, they bought an additional 10-acre parcel of land that adjoined their farm in Silkett Springs. So this gave them a 13-acre farm, which was large for that time. Most Black-owned farms in Loudoun County at this time were only 3 to 5 acres. Then again, the family returned to Silkett Springs in 1917 when Flossie was in about 4th grade. This is the marriage license for Henry and Lorinda. And I do want to point out that one of the witnesses at their marriage was William Sinclair. He was Henry's younger brother, and he, with his family, remained in Montclair for the rest of his life. It's not clear why Henry and Lorinda returned to Loudoun while Flossie was still in school. But from their property purchases, it's clear that they always intended to come home. Did they come back because of family ties? Maybe. Henry had extended family who lived in Silkett Springs. I've had a harder time tracing Lorinda's family. As far as I can tell, she had 2 sisters and a half-brother. One of her sisters moved out of the county by 1904, 1905, and ended up in Albany, New York. Were Henry and Lorinda attached to their farm? Is that why they wanted to come back to Loudoun? As I said, a 13-acre farm was a big deal for African Americans at that time, but they sold it 7 years later. So maybe. Did they feel some sort of connection to Loudoun as a place? Possibly. They may have preferred Loudoun's rolling green hills and the slower pace of life here. And it was probably a combination of all three: family, farm, and just the beautiful rolling green hills of Virginia that made it home for them. This is the house where Flossie Fur's parents were employed and where the family lived probably in an outbuilding, whether it was the carriage house or some other outbuilding. They lived with their employer. Full disclosure, they actually lived in Glen Ridge, not Montclair. Glen Ridge is the community just south of Montclair. It's much smaller. It's not as well known. So with apologies to my friends in Glen Ridge, I'm still going to say Montclair unless I specifically remember to say Glen Ridge. But their employer was Abijah Brewer, who was a prominent citizen of Glen Ridge. He was the town's second mayor from 1902 to 1906, and he was a vice president of Western Union Company. And he sounded like a good employer. So Flossie Fur began her schooling in New Jersey, and she attended Glen Ridge Central School. Try to keep this photo in your mind for the next minute or two. I want to play a couple of audio clips for you. There's just audio, there's no video. And I really want to thank the staff at the Thomas Balch Library for preparing these for me.
And my schooling began in New Jersey. And there's where I never knew anything about race. We lived right there in the big house. We had an off house. But I played with the people's grandchildren, and you never thought about black or white. I attended school, big white school, and it had, I think there were 3 black kids in there in the whole school. So I never knew. I don't know. I guess I must have been awful dumb. But anyway, I went to a black church. I had 2 cousins who lived in Montclair, and I played with them every once in a while. But the subject of race, like it is so prevalent now, never came up. So we stayed there for 5 years, and each summer we'd go to New Hampshire, and my dad would plant this big garden. And
she goes on to say that New Hampshire, where they went in New Hampshire, it was Bristol, New Hampshire, was a delightful place. So she was a long way from home, from Loudoun to New Hampshire. Her oral history was recorded in 1989. She's 81 years old when she's speaking here. So at age 81, Flossie Furr recalled that her teachers made no distinction between children of different races at the school and held them to the same standard. And I think this is an important memory. So this is a photo of the 4th grade at Glenridge Central School, about 10 years earlier from when Flossie would have attended the school. I just think it's so fascinating that already in 1903, there were 4 little Black school children here. They're in the last and the second to last row. So already in 1903, you had Black children attending this school. This is probably the entire 4th grade, two classrooms. Many of the white children would have been the children of Italian and Polish immigrants. This is the school that young Flossie attended when her family returned to Loudoun. So compare that one to the school she attended in Glenridge. She couldn't go to the school in Silkett Springs, even though it was right next to their house, because it was only for whites. The Powell's Grove was the nearest Black school, and it was 4 or 5 miles away. There was no school bus transportation for Blacks at that time. The recording starts with her talking about her mother's realization that she couldn't keep going to school in Powell's Grove because it was too hard to get to. And then Flossie kind of bounces back and forth between school in Loudoun and in Washington, D.C., where she had relatives. And as near as I can figure out, she went to 4th grade in Powell's Grove and then 5th and 6th grade in D.C.
I don't know, from one thing to another, I finally realized that, Mama finally realized that I just could not go to school and walk to Powell's Grove. That was the closest school. So that's where my awakening came, that I found that I could no longer go to a white school because they didn't have integration here. And the closest school was 4 miles. So after I tried it 1 year, or maybe a year and a half, because there's no way I could go in the snow, she sent me to Washington and started me in wherever I was, 5th grade or something like that. And I stayed there during the winter, come home holidays, and I stayed with relatives there? With my relatives. And I went to Garnet Patterson School there in Washington on 10th and U Street. So that's the way I got most of my education. Then there'd be times when I'd get these crying spells and wouldn't stay there and would come home. So
that just really gets me when she says, again, she's 81 years old, and she remembered that she would get these crying spells when she was in DC going to school there. She was 11 or 12 years old. She was living in a strange city apart from her parents. She was homesick. So Flossie returned to Loudoun for 7th grade. She attended a school that had just opened in Purcellville, and Purcellville was about 3 miles from Silkett Springs. You'll hear her talk about getting herself settled. She realizes that in 7th grade it's just not going to work going to school in Loudoun. She got herself settled and kind of buckled down and went back to school in DC.
I did the 7th grade there, and then I got myself settled, and I realized that I was wasting a lot of time by trying to go to school up here because the teachers were, inadequate, and materials were inadequate. It was just a headache because I still lived out Silver Spring, and had to get out here. Sometimes we'd walk, sometimes I'd drive an old buggy. So I went to Washington and finished 8th grade, and then I was settled by then. I went on through high school, and from high school I went to a small college in West Virginia, Astoria College in Harpersburg.
It doesn't mention it here, but Flossie Furr went to Dunbar High School, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then she went on to earn her teaching degree at Storr College, which is in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. It's about 30 miles from Purcellville, so I'm not quite sure how she managed that commute. This is a page from Flossie's senior yearbook. Hers is the fourth photo down on the page, the fourth photo. I want to say a few words about Dunbar because it was super important. Dunbar was the first all-Black public high school in the country. It was very prestigious and it had a rigorous academic curriculum. A significant share of the faculty had PhDs or professional degrees. Upward of 90% of the graduates went on to college, including two-year teacher colleges. A whole host of famous people graduated from Dunbar. I want to name just two. One was Dr. Charles Drew, the surgeon and researcher who discovered blood plasma. And another was Charles Hamilton Houston, who went on to become the dean of the Howard University Law School, the general counsel for the NAACP, and he became known as the man who killed Jim Crow. So he went to Dunbar High School. At Dunbar, classmates chose three adjectives, three words to describe one another. And I guess the yearbook committee compiled them. So Flossie's classmates described her as quiet, helpful, and friendly. So those are qualities that would stand her in good stead when she became a teacher. Students also chose a motto or a quotation, something that spoke to them. And the one that Flossie chose for herself in Latin was "Work conquers all." I also just want to say that not all the adjectives were kind. And some of the other words used to describe some of her classmates were frivolous, corpulent, and temperamental. So Flossie came out well with her among her classmates. So after earning her teacher's certificate in 1933, Flossie started teaching in Loudoun County. And she taught in little 1- and 2-room schools like the one in Willisville, like Powell's Grove, for 15 years. Then in 1947, she began teaching at the brand new Carver Elementary School in Purcellville. Carver had 8 classrooms for grades 1 through 8. Carver was the first all-Black elementary school in Loudoun to have central heat and indoor plumbing. She taught here for 20 years, the entire lifespan of the school. It closed when Loudoun desegregated its schools in 1968 because white families didn't want to send their children to a colored school. After Carver closed, Flossie took a position as a librarian at Douglas Elementary School in Leesburg. And being a lifelong believer in the power of education, she also took coursework in library science because she wanted to be a good librarian. Flossie Furr left behind an impressive legacy. She had 7 children over the course of 13 years, including 2 sets of twins. Her 4 youngest children were twins, and one of them is with us tonight. I'm so happy about that. So that just boggles my mind that she had 2 sets of twins. Most of her children graduated from college, and I believe 3 became teachers. So those are the facts of her life, but the real story lies deeper. As I mentioned, she earned her teaching degree from Storr in 1933 after her first child was born. She and her husband were separated at this time. And her mother died in 1934 after a period of illness. So Flossie Furr was probably raising a toddler, commuting somehow to Harpers Ferry to go to school, and helping to care for her mother all at the same time. Flossie and her husband separated permanently a year or two after her youngest children were born. So she was a single working mother for more than half her career. She also went on to earn her bachelor's degree in education in 1951, also from Storer. Her youngest children at that time would have been 8 years old. So again, I'm struck by how much she juggled to accomplish her goals. She also left a mark on her former students. One of her former students, about 30 years after Flossie Furr retired, the student remembered that sometimes when Flossie Furr handed back an assignment, she would quietly say to the student, "You can do better. You can do better." How many of us had that teacher who let us know that we weren't living up to our potential? And so this woman, 30 years later, said, "Flossie Furr taught us the value of perseverance and hard work." Another student remembered that Flossie Furr taught her to sing. When she was a little girl, this little girl loved to sing at the top of her lungs, kind of scream and yell outside on the playground. And Flossie Furr identified some raw talent there, and she sat down with her at the piano and taught her her first song. The song was Ave Maria. It's a very quiet, prayerful song by Bach. This little girl grew up, went on to sing in her church choir, and she said that to that day, Ave Maria remained her favorite song. Flossie Furr was an accomplished pianist, and she was the organist at her church for 37 years. So I come back to the question, why does Flossie Furr matter? The words resilience and perseverance are frequently used to describe the Black experience in America. And in her case, they really are appropriate. She represents the millions of African Americans who jumped into the unknown and joined the Great Migration. These are also the millions who endured the indignity of second-class citizenship in the South, including its separate and highly unequal schools. Flossie Furr came through these experiences with grace, dignity, and a strong sense of purpose. She started her schooling in Montclair and thought it was normal to attend school with white children and to play with the white grandchildren of her parents' employer. Then she moved back to Loudoun and was immediately confronted with the reality of segregation. She couldn't go to the school that was right next to her house. She showed resilience in overcoming the disruption and homesickness of bouncing back and forth between schools in Loudoun and DC. And she passed on that sense of purpose and perseverance to 2 generations of students, as well as to her own children. So I come back to that motto that Flossie chose for herself as a high school senior: work conquers all. And I think it's a really apt summation of her approach to life and all that she accomplished. I also want to say a few words about the impact that outmigration had on Loudoun. Outmigration forever changed the demographics of Loudoun County. As I mentioned, the migration began and ended earlier than the nationwide Great Migration. We know it started as early as the 1870s and it bottomed out in the 1950s. Outmigration caused Loudoun's Black population to decline by 45% from its peak in 1880, 7,243, that was the peak. And then it declined by 45% to its low in 1950. During these same years, Loudoun's white population grew by almost 5%. That too is not a healthy growth rate and indicates that there is a fair amount of outmigration by whites as well. As a share of the population, African Americans went from being almost a third of Loudoun County's population to less than 20% in 1950. And again, the actual outmigration numbers were higher than this because there would have been natural population growth. Most African Americans who migrated from Loudoun to Montclair and elsewhere stayed in the North, but an important minority, like Flossie Furr's family, came back home. Their time in the North, I believe, would have broadened their horizons and exposed them to a way of life that was free of the rigidities and indignities of Jim Crow segregation. And that experience may have given them a sense of possibility, of opportunity, and of personal worth. Flossie Furr recalled at age 81 that her teachers in Montclair treated Black children and white children the same and held them to the same standards. It's probably not a coincidence that two others that I know of who returned from Montclair to Loudoun went on to form their own businesses, to be their own bosses. So beyond the numbers, how did outmigration affect Loudoun County? By 1900, Loudoun had about 30 small African-American communities scattered across the county. Most were formed after the Civil War. This booklet by the Black History Committee of the Thomas Balch Library does a great job documenting these communities with a really great map. A local African-American historian concluded that the decline in Loudoun's Black population made it hard to sustain Black social organizations. There were a number of mutual aid societies and fraternal organizations. The Oddfellows were the largest of these. The outmigration, the decline in numbers, also made it hard to sustain the small churches that were at the heart of these small historic communities. Many of these historic Black communities have all but disappeared. A few, like Louisville, remain and are proudly rooted in their past. A recent survey sponsored by the county found that just in the past 20 years, Loudoun has lost 1/5 of historic sites associated with African Americans due to rapid suburban growth. Today, there's growing recognition in the county of the need to preserve and protect these places. Loudoun's historic Black communities are places worth remembering, and so are the people who lived there. I knew I would choke up, but I do believe these places are worth remembering, and so are the people who lived there. And with that, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I truly learned a lot about Loudoun and Flossie's life. I'm inviting anyone who would like to unmute, share anything, memories, ask questions, or if you would like to use the chat, I'm happy to read that on anyone's behalf as well.
My name is Cooper.
I think I heard someone. Is that Joanne? Oh, thank you, Caroline. I can see her a little better. I guess I could look this up on Google, and if you don't know, that's fine. I was wondering just what Loudoun's current population was today.
About 440,000. So
Okay.
it was a little over 20,000 in 1920 and 440,000. And all of this growth has happened, or most of this growth has happened in the last 30 years.
Yes. Interesting. I just wanted to connect Caroline. Betty Holloway, who's on tonight, is the historian who's done all that research on the Huey family. So I just want to introduce you both as well. She's joined us this evening.
Yes, and I watched one of her presentations, the one on celebration of the life of Alice Huey Foster. So that's where I got a lot of my great information from. Yes, indeed. One thing I didn't mention, because I thought we might run short on time, but people might be interested in how did I stumble across this story? How did I get from Loudoun to Montclair? Um, in the process of doing some research for the museum, I read through about 3 dozen oral histories of African Americans at the Thomas Balch Library. And it was one of those oral histories, one person had lived in Montclair in the 1930s and had gone from first through seventh grade there. His name was Basham Sims. And he mentioned that there was a large community of African Americans from Loudoun living in Montclair. And I went, really? Why? Well, where's Montclair? And it took me a while to sort of get back to this and dig into it. And I'm embarrassed to say, I think I just did a really basic Google search, African Americans in Montclair, and I found Joseph Roby's blog. And Joseph Roby is a professional genealogist, and in the process of researching his ancestors, the Dulaney family, who owned a plantation in Fauquier County, he got interested in researching the enslaved at Oakley. And his blog post listed a name, gave a list of names of the enslaved and their descendants that he was researching. And he very helpfully coded them by where he traced them to. So F meant they stayed in Fauquier. L meant they moved over, they hopped across the border to Loudoun. DC, NYC, and then M from Montclair. So there's that Montclair again. So I immediately emailed Joseph, hey, what's up with Montclair? And before the poor guy even had a chance to respond, I found the article in New Jersey History by Patricia Egett about racial politics in Montclair between 1920 and 1940. And that kind of pulled the whole picture to me. And on the very first page of her article, she referred to the number of African Americans in Montclair who had come from Loudoun and Fauquier counties. So that's how this whole thing started.
Thank you for sharing that. There was one question on the chat, and I also just wanted to mention I was reflecting so much about Flossie's experience at school in Montclair versus in Virginia. It wasn't until, and anyone on this call, correct me if I'm getting the range wrong, the 1970s to 80s, Montclair functioned off a neighborhood school system, which actually caused de facto segregation based on where you were living. So Montclair created this magnet school system that essentially was busing across different parts of town, which still exists today to desegregate neighborhood schools because of based upon where others would live. So if you got rid of the magnet school system today in Montclair, you would see very different type of schooling for neighborhood school or divide as well. It's pretty interesting. And her experience as well, reflecting on that too. Joseph, who we were, I think, just speaking about, said, what is your next research project? Or will you continue research on Loudoun and Montclair?
It's a good question. I have posited, maybe assumed that the reason that there was such a high rate of outmigration from Loudoun is because of the proximity to DC and the presence of the railroad line that went directly to Arlington, Virginia. I probably need to explore that more deeply. Were there other things going on in Loudoun County between 1900 and 1930 that made it particularly inhospitable to African Americans? So that might be one direction I go in. I still would like to kind of turn back to some of the work I had done on Black-owned businesses in Loudoun in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's a story that's a little harder to wrap my arms around. This was a nice story because it was very contained, so I could scope it out pretty easily.
Hey, Caroline, I want to thank you for the work that you put into this research. And it was a special treat for me just to hear my grandmother's voice again.
Oh, thank you. I was a little concerned how you might react to it, but she had a wonderful voice, a deep, confident voice. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you, Elaine.
We're so happy, Elaine, that you and Carolyn and Omar and Orton and Joan are all here joining us this evening. And I'm sorry if I've missed any of the other fur family members who are with us tonight, but we're delighted that we've gotten connected and that you were able to be here this evening, and hope we can continue to have a good relationship with you all and learn more and more.
Hi, Caroline. It's Betty Holloway.
Hello, Betty.
Hi. Did you happen to find out what was the name of the church that Flossie attended in Montclair?
I don't know the one she attended in Montclair.
Okay.
Here at home, she attended Elaine, Mount Olive Baptist Church.
Mhm.
Mount Olive Baptist Church. So maybe she attended, was it St. Paul's?
Baptist. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Who is she?
Another historian.
Any other thoughts, questions? I think anything in the chat that was mentioned got read.
Yeah, I'm gonna say
Great, can you say it now? Say this is a what? Go ahead.
hello.
Hi, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank y'all for doing this piece on my mother. I know if she was still alive, she'd be very proud that you have done this. And I've learned a few extra things about my mother that I didn't know, but it was really great. I enjoyed it, and I wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you so much for
Thank
saying
you.
that. That's really important to me.
Thank you. Actually, one more question came in, Caroline, is I've heard Loudoun was the last county in the US to desegregate. Is that true? Of those African Americans who stayed in Loudoun, what did they do for work?
I am pretty sure that Loudoun was the last locality in Virginia to desegregate, 1968, and it was only after 2 court orders. It wouldn't surprise me if it was the last, but I've also heard that Talbot County in Maryland was the last county to desegregate its schools. So I'm not sure, but it was one of the last. And what did African Americans do for employment here in Loudoun? Well, this was always the challenge, and this is why so many left. There just weren't jobs here. And the younger generation, say born after 1935, they didn't want to work as domestics. They didn't necessarily want to work as farm laborers. I will say, I mentioned that Loudoun and Fauquier counties are the heart of Virginia horse country. So there was an important community of Black horsemen here in Loudoun, particularly in the little village of St. Louis and in Howardsville. These were the grooms, the stable managers, the trainers, and even some breeders who were the foundation of the horse industry here in Loudoun. So that was a source of employment. Many African American men worked in the building trades. They were skilled builders. They came out of enslavement in a sense with a skill. Purcellville had a very tightly knit Black community. Many of them worked as carpenters, stonemasons, bricklayers, cement layers. Middleburg also had a pretty vibrant, small, but successful Black business community. Also in the building trades, there was a very notable Black builder, William Nathan Hall, who at one point his company was the largest employer of Black men in the county. He built a number of really nice buildings here in the county. His company also won the contract to rebuild the grist mill at Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate, back in the 1930s. So that's pretty impressive for this tiny little company, this tiny little business in Loudoun County to get that contract. Middleburg had a couple of other building contractors, a roofing contractor. So yeah, I would say the building trades were for men. women continued to work as cooks for a pretty long time, I would say.
Hey, Caroline, I was also the last class that attended Carver before
Oh,
integration.
interesting. And then where did you end up going to school after that?
Emmerich Elementary School.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, my grandmother was still in the building. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to be in her class,
I was
but
going to ask, did you have her as a teacher?
no.
But some of her children had her as a teacher, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
All of them. All of them?
All of
All of them.
There's in reading the oral histories that I went through, many describe many it's clearly understood that the all black schools did not get a fair shake. They were underfunded, they were overcrowded. But the people who attended these schools also felt that there was a tight-knit community within these schools and that the teachers really cared about the students. And the story that many of them told was, if you acted up in school, your mother would know about it before you got home. Like, you probably had that experience, you and your aunts and uncles, you know. It was a tight-knit community. I think there was some sense of loss when schools desegregated, but as well as a recognition that it was a huge achievement, 50 years in the making.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Caroline. Thank you to Loudoun Museum, and thank you to Flossie First family for being with us here this evening and for sharing your memories. Truly, thank you. We will share this recording with all those who registered. If for some reason that email does not find its way to you, just either contact the Loudoun Museum or the Montclair History Center. We will make sure you get that link. And we also will send again the resource list, which I pasted a lot of information in there. So don't worry if you didn't catch all that. We'll send that out again as well, too. Thank you
Thank
all
you
for
so much,
being with us
Angelica.
tonight.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Thank you. We
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Great night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, all.
Right.